What's going on, guys? Welcome to Drinks and Thinks. That's drinking content and thinking content. Today is going to be all about mezcal, specifically these ones here. I'm going to explain why I've chosen these later on in the video. But before we start, £60, £100, 120 quid. Why is mezcal so expensive is a question that I hear a lot. And really, the expensive part should be framed slightly differently because I think there's a judgment in the word expensive. Perhaps a better question to ask is, what is it that gives mezcal its value versus other spirits? Why should someone pay X amount of pounds for this liquid versus the other options available? So here is your definitive guide and answer to that question. Hopefully by the end of this video, I can convince you to perhaps opt for a mezcal as opposed to another spirit. But really, they're all good. They all have their merits, the pros and cons to them. What we want to do here is approach a brand training in a Drinks and Thinks style. I'm not a professional, but it's going to be sick. So what I've done is I've super scientifically identified 3 main reasons why mezcal is so expensive, and then an extra bonus one. The 3 before are going to be more inherent to the properties of the actual plant itself. The other one is going to be production and how we operate with it to create the actual liquid itself. I think they're separate. Perhaps they're not. I don't know. We'll get to it. We'll get to it, and you can decide in the comments below. So before we start, what we need to do is get through some definitions. Although what you'll notice with this video is it's going to be slightly light on details, but it's going to be more about vibes. And that's generally the approach that I'm going to take with a lot of these category training information style videos. I think that when it comes to learning, it's more about storytelling, and vibes actually are the things that we tend to remember, the things that we can recall, and the things that make us interested in a certain category or product or whatever it may be, versus just a list of sort of dates or specific regulations to memorize. If you're a professional, that's very important. I'm not a professional, so I get the freedom to just kind of say what I want, and you can judge me on a meritocratic way and choose to like the video or not in this instance. But hopefully you're going to like it because it's going to be sick. Mezcal overall is quite expensive as a category, right? What is mezcal? This isn't going to be super duper agave training because, again, with this video, what I want to do is answer the question of why it's expensive. A few facts that you should know if you're just coming across this video and Drinks and Thinks for the first time, assuming you know nothing about mezcal, Mexico, and the agave plant in general. To begin, we need to define what agave is. First of all, it's a plant. It's from Mexico. It's indigenous to Mexico, and it's been part of its history for thousands of years. It kind of looks like a cross between an aloe vera and a cactus. It's like a really hench, aggressive looking aloe vera type thing. But interestingly, it has nothing to do with either of those plants. It's not part of the family or the genus or anything like that. It has no relation to those two things, despite looking a lot like both of them. So its closest relative that you may know is an asparagus. You eat it for breakfast every so often, eggs benedict, whatever it may be. This is actually the closest sort of relative that you would know within the asparagus, whatever. I'll put it on screen so you can see. What this has in common with the agave plant that you find in Mexico is it takes a really long time to grow. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. Mezcal, the category, it's a spirit made from the agave plant. You may hear the term maguey or see maguey written. Those can be used completely interchangeably. Maguey is sort of the local name for agave. It's been used in various different ways. What ancient Mexicans used to do was essentially chop the top off, and inside was delicious honey. Like the sap from this was fermented, and this is called pulque. Sort of beer, mead, essentially the fermented sap from the plant. When you chop it off, you can just sort of scoop it out with a giant straw, and it's delicious. It's really, really delicious. It tastes like honey. Ancient Mexicans would have got really drunk off of this and, you know, got close to their gods, and, you know, ancient elites would have used for rituals and ceremonies and these sorts of things. But what's cool about pulque is it ties. It's a direct link between the sort of the ancient Mexicans and, you know, modern Mexicans today, hipsters in Mexico City. You can go to a pulqueria and you can just drink pulque, and it's the same as it was thousands of years ago, which is really cool. With our agave plant, there are about 200 different species. About 30 of them are used to make mezcal. I'm not going to go into crazy detail about all of the different species, just there are a lot. So that's a bit around the raw ingredient and the agave. It's a cousin of asparagus. It takes long to grow. It's from Mexico. It sort of looks like an aloe vera and a cactus. This is the starting point and the sugar that's ultimately going to be fermented and then distilled to make mezcal. This plant has been around for generations and thousands of years. What changed essentially was when colonization happened and Spanish came over with knowledge of distillation. And that's when the sugars from the agave plant would have been distilled into what we sort of understand today as mezcal. Okay, so that's a slightly pit stop tour of agave. One other thing before we start is that tequila is technically a mezcal. So tequila is one type of mezcal. Tequila is made from the Blue Weber species of agave, which is one species of mezcal among many. This is sort of the famous one that's made it out of Mexico for the most part and is known around the world. Tequila, by the way, is a town in Mexico in the region where tequila is made. For the purpose of this video, I recognize that tequila and mezcal are the same thing, right? 100 years ago, tequila would have been known as mezcal. It just would have been one species of many. In the modern context, they are treated differently. And I think the average consumer thinks of them as two different things, right? That's why we call one tequila and one mezcal, even though, yes, they are the same. It's part of a category. The way that we talk around mezcal in some ways isn't helpful because it's like, well, which mezcal? Is it this one? Is it that one? There's a bunch of different species. So you've got an umbrella term as one, and then you've got a specific species as another. If you look at these, you've got Espadin, Tobola, and Salmiana. This should be known as Espadin, and its common name should be Espadin, and everyone should write Espadin on cocktail menus and that sort of stuff. But instead, it's called mezcal, and it's probably listed as mezcal on most menus. So whether we like it or not, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to treat tequila differently and just talk around what the average consumer considers mezcal, which is basically everything that isn't tequila. Probably they also think that it's always smoky, which it isn't necessarily. But again, if that's what it takes to sort of learn during this video, then so be it. But back to the topic and back to the question at hand. Why is mezcal so expensive, or what gives mezcal its value? That's a long ass introduction. Let's get to my 3 general principles as to why mezcal is expensive, or I should say, what gives mezcal its value. And we're going to use these 3 examples. The reason that I'm choosing these bottles, as I mentioned, I'll talk through that at the end of the video. Cool. So first and foremost, it's the time that is spent in the ground with this product, with the plant that is used to make the sugar, which is then fermented and then distilled. So your starting point really for mezcal is around 6 to 8 years. 6 to 8 years, that's mental. 6 to 8 years it has to grow in the ground to reach full maturity before it's then used. So if you think of that contrast when you compare it to something like wheat or sugarcane, something that within a year you just get all of this abundant raw product that you're then gonna use. Mezcal just doesn't have that. Let's use the example of Espadin, right? So 6 to 8 years, and this is sort of the starting point and the entry level mezcal. The first mezcal that you try would be Espadin. Espadin also makes up the vast majority of mezcal sales. I think like 85%, 90%, something like that. To be legally called mezcal, it has to be grown in a select number of regions across Mexico. Same for tequila, although we're not going to go into that. Really, I don't find this super helpful because there's lots of weird ones and you've got to just remember what the list is, and the geographical regions don't really make any sense in terms of why this can be called a mezcal and this legally can't be called a mezcal. So none of it really makes sense. I think there's a bit of politics involved as well. So for me, it's not that important to know. I'll post a picture so you can see that and you can learn it if you want. But if you have to remember one, when it comes to mezcal, most of the mezcal production comes from Oaxaca, and most of the mezcal made in Oaxaca is Espadin. So this is the backbone of the mezcal world. This is the default, so to speak. But really, that's what I wanted to highlight. It's the time spent in the ground. And so the starting point, as in the cheapest, most accessible default mezcal, still takes 6 to 8 years to grow in the ground. And like I said, that's the starting point. It can go up to, I think, 30 years or something like that. And going back to the asparagus example that I used earlier on in the video, asparagus also takes, I think, like 3 years to grow as well. Let me fact check this right now. Yeah, asparagus takes 3 years to establish for a full harvest. Boom. So even with the asparagus example, a distant cousin still takes 3 years to grow. So next time you're eating asparagus, take a thought. You know, that's 3 years. 3 years to reach full maturity. That's kind of mad. That's actually like That's crazy. So this is the first principle, the time spent in the ground, and probably the biggest factor as to why the cost of the resulting liquid is so much and what gives mezcal its inherent value. And so rather than time spent in a barrel, you should think about it in terms of time spent and aged in the ground. Both have value, but particularly when we're talking about the plant and the nuances and flavor that it brings, I think that's what makes mezcal just unlike any other product in the world, any other plant in the world, and the resulting liquid and the differences in characteristics and terroir and all that sort of amazing tastiness really stems from this first principle, which is time spent in the ground as to what gives mezcal its value. The next factor is sort of environment, not quite terroir. What I'm talking about when I say environment is where, in terms of the terrain, where a lot of these species actually grow, rather than which part of Mexico that it comes from. Tobola, for example, it grows naturally in rocky, sort of high altitude canyons, often between sort of boulders and cliffs and that sort of stuff. And Tobola, rather than being sort of big and spiky, and I'll put pictures up, Tobola is like short and fat and stumpy, sort of like the chode espadin. Meaning that if you're a mezcalero, you and the boys have got to go out and actively find it. You can't just sort of grow it in neat lines, or maybe you can now, but that's not usually the case. It's wild. You have to go out and get it, right, on the land that you own. This is the other factor that makes mezcal expensive. So finally, our last principle is yield. How much product can you actually get from these different species? And the answer is basically not a lot. And that's very much the case with Salmiana. So Salmiana's yield is much less because it's very fibrous, despite the fact that it's a giant species, right? It's absolutely huge in size. So its yield is much less. It still takes at least 12 years to grow. Not many people grow it as a result. There's just less of it around. It's a much smaller category, and outside of espadin, which makes up the bulk of mezcal volume, there's really just not a lot of that liquid around. And so what you're tasting is something super duper special, and all of the characteristics that I've mentioned before. Just one more example on yield, which isn't the Salmiana, but it's this is from Macorichos. Shout out Gonzalo. Anyway, on this you've got one called Jabali, right? And this is famous for having a really, really low yield. And the reason it has a really low yield is it has a thing called saponins. And a saponin is basically what makes soap foamy. It's that compound, right, that makes soap foam. Jabali is full of saponins. So what that means is during the fermentation process, it basically goes completely wild and overflows and it's bubbling like crazy, very unpredictable, just an absolute nightmare to ferment. And the yield is absolutely tiny as a result. So that's an extreme example at one end, but still the overall yield for all mezcals is just way lower than other alternatives. And that's what you should have in mind when it comes to making your decision to buy any given mezcal. What I've put together is a small table that goes into a bit more detail so you can see exactly what the yields are comparatively compared to other species of agave and then compared to wheat. And what you'll notice is that it takes way more tonnage of plant to make a given measurement of spirit for agave than it does with any other plant that's used to make spirits. So wheat, corn, any of these. If we use espadin as the baseline, tequila, for example, delivers about 110% of the yield of espadin, right? So you get slightly more bang for your buck when it comes to tequila, and that's part of the reason why that is the most popular agave spirit, why it's famous, why everyone knows about it, right? Just one of the many different reasons. When we look at something like wheat, is about 400%, 4 times as much spirit for the same amount of raw product plant material. If we go to Jabali on the other end of the spectrum, Jabali only delivers about 40% of the yield of espadin. So way, 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 way lower, but you can see how this would raise the value, and you know how labor intensive and what a nightmare this product is to use. Actually, it kind of makes it a bit more interesting. You might be willing to pay more as a result. Also, the flavors are super complex and all that sort of stuff, which is the case for most species of agave. And yeah, Tobola 60%, Salmiana is 90%. It's the incentives, right? If you've got X amount of species of agave, why would you choose the ones that are annoying to cultivate and are ultimately going to cost you in labor and all these other factors? All the incentives are for you to just grow blue Weber agave, really. So it's time, environment, yield. Those are the big three as I see it. If you know anything different, let me know in the comments, any other factors. The final thing that I'll mention in terms of, rather than, it being fibrous, and the reason that it's more fibrous is what gives you the lower yield, etc. That's sort of inherent to the plant. Production process is another factor, right? So there are a few definitions when it comes to the production process of mezcal. And basically you've got 3 different categories. All you need to know is one is called industrial, one is called artisanal, and one is called ancestral. And basically it's a line going from more industrial methods to more traditional methods, and there are specific definitions for each of those. I'll put more information in the caption so you can understand those in a bit more detail if you want. I don't think it's that important personally. If I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments why I'm wrong. And the term ancestral implies like thousands of years, and so I think from a consumer perspective, I think what you're expecting is something that's ancient. The evidence suggests that actually the distillation techniques that are used with clay pots came from the Philippines during the colonial era. So I don't know, 1500s, something like that, which is still really old. But I think it's like, is it ancient? I don't know. But the distillation practice is not like pulque. Pulque is ancient. That's been going on for thousands of years. But the distillation is kind of a colonial thing coming from Philippines rather than something that was created. I don't know. Basically, the production methods are going to be the final sort of factor that adds cost to the final liquid. Cool. So we've got our 3+1 reasons why mezcal is so expensive. Slightly light on details, but 100% on vibes, which we love. And that is the drinking and thinking approach that we take here. We learned about asparagus. We learned about ancient beer. We got to learn about espadin. We learned about tobala and salmiana. Basically, there are so many different species, not enough to cover in one video. Really, you should just get out there and try different tasty mezcals so that you can learn and you can find a flavor or one that you particularly like. In a different video, I'm going to try these and we're going to go through the flavor notes and how to use them in a bit more detail. Similarly, I'll probably do another video specifically on the maguey, the agave history in a bit more detail, because there's lots of storytelling and myths and legends that are super important to the wider culture of Mexico and its traditions. And so that needs a full focus for the next video. But yeah, why is mezcal so expensive? Well, it's time spent in the ground. It's the environment that makes it really tricky to cultivate. It's the yield that you get from the actual plant itself. And then, of course, can be really slow and laborious traditional methods of production. All of these things can add to the cost of mezcal, but the result and the plant itself is different to any other spirit. The agave and the time that it spends in the ground means that the expressions and the spirits that are made from it are truly, truly special. They're truly unique. And that's why it's better than lots of other spirit categories, and why you should consider actually spending and investing in a mezcal brand that you enjoy. As always, speak to a bartender and get their thoughts, and just try as many different variants and different regions as possible, and your bartender will be your spiritual guide. Finally, one thing that I love about these bottles and why I've used them today, this isn't an advert, is that when you think about trying to get across the value to consumers, if you look at what whiskey's done, what rum's done, they'll have the age statements, as in how long the spirit has spent in a barrel. They'll have that on the front of the bottle, right? 16 years, 20 years, 8 years, whatever it may be. And this is a proxy for quality. Your average consumer will look at that and think, okay, it's been in a barrel for 16 years, therefore it's spent a lot of time taking on flavor and changing flavor and developing, so therefore this is worth 100 quid or whatever the value of the thing is, or the fact that it's expensive is justified because it spent such a long time aging in a barrel in this example. Problem with mezcal is that not a lot of people understand the category or don't understand why a clear spirit is worth X amount, right? What's really cool about Lost Explorer is the liquid is good, of course, but what I really like is that they include the age statement on the bottle. So this is an age statement. It's years spent in the ground to communicate quality to consumers in a language that they perhaps understand, even though they still might be ignorant as to the exact details and those sorts of things, right? So I really like this convention, and I think that more mezcal brands should absolutely be showing off the amount of time, the age in agave in their liquids, because ultimately you're conveying quality and price and value to consumers that might not be super educated on the intricacies of mezcal production and species and all that sort of stuff. This was the vibes-based definitive guide as to why mezcal is so expensive and why you should this year ball out on some tasty agave liquid. Hopefully, I've convinced you. I'm not a professional. Some of these may need a fact check. Please do me a favor. If you've learned something new today, please drop a like down below. That would help me out massively. And also drop a comment. Was there anything I should have spoken about in a bit more detail? Have I left anything off? Are there any other factors that you think are important that people should know? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe here. And then if you want to see an interesting video on carbonation history, you can click here as well. Yeah, subscribe for Drinks and Thinks. It's drinking content and thinking content.